Right, Trafford Co. Question 17. So this was very much about systems. So you have this business, by way of introduction, July the 1st, and they manufacture engine parts supplied to a major car manufacturer. This is the year end. So we're looking at some documentation to do with their controls. They work on a just-in-time approach. So yeah, so we've done PM literally, sort of that sort of world of EOQ, isn't it? So you have this sort of in organizations, inventory falls to a certain point, and then it sends a signal to the client, and then it comes back up, and that sort of approach. And then they are the suppliers, if you like. So typically, they need to have sufficient inventory to meet customer demand at very short notice. So the inventory systems are linked to their clients. That's what I said. Delivery requirement within 12 hours of being replaced. So they've been recently experiencing some problems with their systems, which have led to orders not being processed and penalties being incurred in the process. So what's interesting here is that rather than refund customers for the penalty, customers themselves, it's interesting, deduct the amount of the penalty from the payment due. So there are issues here in terms of, well, it says it here clearly, no check is performed to confirm that the amount paid is equivalent to the invoiced amount less the penalty payment. So there's a problem with the system in the first place. There's just a problem with the process of determining how much the customer would pay. Normal systems would either it would, because I think the first problem here is that the client Trafford themselves should send, if you like, well, either a full invoice and then send a credit note, which is a normal system, because the penalty should be more like a signal or a legal document, or yeah, it's not part of the accounting. It's just a document that says you have you breached this agreement, and then in response to that, a credit note should be sent to reduce the valuation of the invoice. And that's really the argument, isn't it? Um, so let's look at that. So in order to meet its contractual terms, Trafford Co production line operates 24 hours a day, and a limited number of production staff are employed to oversee. So I would see this as a weakness as well. It means that you don't have enough to oversee the machinery. So there's potential risk there in terms of just, if you like, efficiency and health and sort of safeguarding health and safety. Then supervisors oversee the production staff. That's good. So this is good as well. So sometimes, like I say, these questions are a mixture of some of the good controls, or what controls we have in place, what controls we can rely on, if you like, but some of the controls we just can't rely on. So anyway, we have some good controls right here. Until the start of the year, maintenance was carried out every 3 months. So this is a weakness. They've dropped the amount of time they spend working on their maintenance contracts. It says employees work 8 shifts with 3 shifts. So exactly. So this is 24-hour sort of run business. And during holiday periods, employees are offered overtime to cover at this time, or overtime is not authorized. So that's definitely an issue. Employees complete a timesheet sent directly to payroll. Problem number 1. And payment is made the following week. Problem number 2. So obviously there are a failure of control activities, SOAP maps, authorization, review, accuracy, monitoring, all failing at both ends here. Due to sickness, the payroll department is understaffed, another issue, and the payroll manager is currently processing all payroll payments. So another failure of segregation of duty here. So anyway, they want you to, yes, for 12 marks, go in there and pull out 4 deficiencies, recommended control, and really a test of control is what is really, again, these are observations, and you're really looking at the whatever the recommendation was. That's what you're doing. So you implemented this new control. So just react to the question, whatever it is your deficiency is, whatever recommendation you make, work on assessing that new system. So I've written here that the first one I've picked is that no check is performed, probably the biggest one, and always discuss the consequence, if you like. So the consequence here, if you like, is that what you're likely to see is that you are not receiving as much funding, as much money for your product as you would expect, and therefore your revenue is understated. Yeah, and I think that's the main point: the fact that your revenue is understated because you don't have the right controls, and your customers are paying less than they should pay. I suppose you could argue that because if you now chase that up, there might be resistance, or it's difficult. But the point here is that your revenue is understated as a result of you not doing that. But you're always, like I say, you're always highlighting what consequences of your argument. You must clearly highlight that. So I've written here in anger, change the system entirely. Whether it really doesn't, like I say, either you keep the system or you have a way of chasing up, or you're regularly reviewing the difference between the notes, the invoices, and the penalty statements for each client, or change the system so that you clearly understand the difference. Or, like I said here, review the invoice before the invoices are put into the system. Um, but the problem I think here is the fact that the client just pays the difference. So I've written here review new system. I mean, I've done that for all of them, but the point here is whatever your control recommendation is, you're actually walking through that new system is the point. And you can be specific. So you can actually pick a certain number, a fixed number, a sample to review, for the system is now working and it's now doing what it should. So they offer overtime. Overtime is not authorized. So consequence is that the organization will end up paying more than it should, and that can potentially lead to fraud. You will have, you basically have the company paying more than it should. So really, I've written here, really, I think a standardization of overtime is important, so we can clearly record overtime and then authorize it. And then, if you like, now what we're doing is reviewing this new system we've put in place. This idea here that they're sending directly, no, all timesheets should be authorized by the relevant manager, and then it should be authorized by, if you like, a financial director before it is paid. So you almost need two steps here. The managers on the ground, because they're the ones who actually see the work being done, authorize the timesheets, and then the FD authorizes the process after it's been put through payroll. So it can't just be done, which is what we're seeing here, because you have the payroll manager literally processing and paying staff. So what you're automatically seeing here is potential for fraud on the creating fictitious clients, or fictitious employees, or errors. There's really the consequence: errors, fraud, due to this lack of segregation of duty. And now what we're really doing here is, all we're doing here is reviewing these controls. We're reviewing SOAP maps. We're reviewing to see that authorizations are now taking place, reviews are now taking place, signatures are now happening, segregation of duty is now in place. That's what we're reviewing, right? We're reviewing controls. Right. I think for me here, I think two of the basic internal controls are, it's all good. Well, I think I mentioned in class, when you see controls, always think control activities, SOAP maps. So to make it a bit more grounded. Okay, you've put authorizations in place, you've put segregation of duties in place, you've put hierarchies in place, you've put monitoring in place, supervision is in place. But we're saying that it's possible that you can have human error, first of all. That's the first thing I think is, and that's true. And typically, controls are designed for routine activities. So when you have unusual activities, it's possible that control activities might not be able to pick them up. So those are the two I thought were good. But of course, please review the answers. Substantive procedures or penalty payments. So there are a number of assertions here, actually. I actually thought, well, listen, you actually want to ensure that we are recognizing all the penalty payments, but it's possible that we're not recognizing all of them. So it's about completeness. And whenever we talk about completeness, we're looking externally. We're looking externally to the organization, right? That's the first point with completeness. So we're looking at the actual penalties coming from the correspondence from lawyers or wherever to see that they've all been accounted for, not from within. Accuracy, and then of course the valuation. This was to do with the idea that with the customers only giving us what they felt less the penalty. And then I've also put down classification. So I've written here, get a full list of the orders not processed on time and the associated penalties. Um, yeah, and then I think a number of things here. I thought, listen, why don't you just try and understand how these penalties are processed? How does it actually work? What is the process for determining and recording penalties? You're not probably going to write this as formally as I've written it. And then review the calculation of the associated penalties on to the unfulfilled orders for the year. So you're almost just trying to understand what the total penalties are for the year. I've said then determine the expected penalties for the year based on the unfulfilled orders. However you think about it, just think, listen, what should the penalties be for the year? What have we recorded as penalties so far? Right. So if you have the full list and you know how it should be recorded, you can actually get an expectation. And that starts to give you an understanding of what penalties have been recorded so far. Um, I've written here, compare budgeted penalties against actual penalty shortfall, look at the difference, um, determine this if the sample will be expanded based on the degree of variance. That's where I was going. What steps management should make to retrieve the difference. Um, so, so I actually think as well, what you can do is you can also take because really we're really trying to assess the reasonableness of the value, aren't we, to see the difference. And we can also review a list of penalties that have been paid so far, or if you like, invoices that have been paid so far with their associated penalties to see the difference, if you like, in what we can do. Okay, overtime, not too tricky. So generally, the argument here is there's a risk that overtime payments exceed the overtime hours. So there's a people who have paid more than we should have for overtime. So again, just understanding the system. How is overtime determined? Let's get a full list of overtime hours worked. Um, I've written here, obtain an expected budgeted overtime hours based on the jobs. Review the variances. Oh, sorry, this is from my previous. Yeah, this is just from my previous sheet. One second. Oh, yeah. Reconcile a. These are penalty. Sorry, I think I've double added my. Yes, I think these are. I think this was where I was going to stop really on the overtime payments. So yeah, so with overtime payments, these are some of the things that I've talked about here. And then of course you can of course recalculate, reperform some of these calculations. Take a list of employees and map or match, if you like, agree, if you like, their overtime hours to the overtime actually paid. I mean, the problem here, again, like I say, is that we know these overtime hours are not being authorized. So I think that's what we're ultimately trying to do, which is why we had to go back to the budget, is to see the extent to which overtime hours exceed the actual overtime figure. Okay, great stuff. And that's kind of how you can tackle some of that work on overtime, substantive procedures and overtime payments. Okay.